Hello and welcome to PSU 6 o'clock news. I'm David Smith.
And I'm Ryan Silva.
Today we will be discussing the tensions at the ports, and to help us better understand what's going on there, we have representatives from both sides of the conflict that is causing so much drama at Terminal 6. Representing the Port Authority, ICTSI, we have Charles Boswell.
Hello.
And representing the Longshoremen Union, we have Jason Zoich.
Glad to have a place at the table.
Also, to help the rest of us better understand the intricacies of port operations and what continued slowdowns could mean to local businesses, we have logistics specialist Peter Nelson joining in.
Hello.
Ryan, over to you.
Well, what we'd like to know to start with is, why did the Port of Portland short sell the longshoremen by entering into a 25-year lease with a less than favorable tenant?
Well, in 2010, the Port of Portland decided to lease out the terminal to us, ICTSI, a private company, because the Port of Portland wasn't making money on this particular enterprise. And so they thought that privatizing it to us was a way to stem their losses. So they brought us on to try and run the Port of Portland, to run Terminal 6 as efficiently as possible as the terminal manager, try and attract new business and hire workers that we like, and so on.
Right. So I guess we understand that to date you haven't been able to deliver on that promise. So what are the current issues with the current lease that preventing you from fulfilling your promise to the city?
So we're going to do everything we can to preserve the flow of cargo and carriers here, because once that stops, the likelihood of it starting again is not great for the Port of Portland. And then the rebate program that is the port's latest attempt to rescue the largest international cargo hub by this union dispute that broke out in June. It's not good. So the problem is that the union workers do not want to do their job and do the work for us at ICTSI.
By that, do you mean that the Longshoremen Union denies, or does that correlate to them denying staging slowdowns at the terminal? Sorry, are you inferring that they are staging slowdowns on the job?
Oh yes, they are. They are dragging their feet. They are refusing to work. They're having protests and a lot of other, and they're taking us to court, and generally causing a lot of difficulties in keeping the flow of goods. From our standpoint, keeping the flow of goods moving.
So, Mr. Boswell, do you have any proof of that?
So, well, first off, they're continually say that we need to meet their demands as far as this, but they're laborers. Our contract should be in with the companies that bring in the goods for in the containers and offload them. They're there to operate the equipment, stuff like that. We pay commensurate raises that are very competitive on the open market, and they should be willing to accept those wages and benefits that we provide.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, has a third party concluded that they've actually been staging slowdowns, or is this just something ICTSI is making up?
They're saying that the slowdowns are not their fault. However, had they kept up productivity at the same rate that they were working at before, there wouldn't be slowdowns. So the evidence is definitely there that they're the ones doing the slowdowns, not actually, because they're not keeping up at the same pace that they used to.
Was this decided in any court by any chance?
No, the court has said that this is that we're not handling the dispute properly, but we're appealing that decision.
And with regard to the slowdown, did the court have anything to say?
The court has so far ruled in their favor, but that's not to be unexpected. The courts have always been pro-union in their stance, collective bargaining in their stances.
I see, but I'm looking at a previous case where it seems like a federal judge did rule in your favor and agreed that the longshoremen were slowing down cargo and put an injunction and ordered them to start offloading it at normal rates. Is that correct? Has that happened?
That has happened. Yes, it did.
Oh, okay.
And that did happen. And
let's jump over to Jason Zoich. Mr. Zoich, why have the international longshoremen and warehouse unions, the West Coast ports, worked slower than in previous years and quarters, despite the 2014 finding that efforts to slow work was intentional?
Aside from not having a position at the bargaining table and being excluded from any talks to what was going on at Terminal 6, we really suffered from violation of OSHA standards, which have put our employees and our union members at risk because this tenant, as opposed to the previous tenant, sends chassis that don't fit the crates that we have to offload and unload. And what that turns into on the ground is waiting for those correct size chassis to arrive. If you can imagine a big crane system and network, we can't just put any chassis on the crates, so that becomes a big problem. One of the things that ICTSI did not want to do, they did not want to reach out on the other end in those eastern ports to ensure that these chassis were matching the crates that got sent through. And that's been the primary complaint that we've had on the union side. Never mind the fact that if you go with the union, unionized workers, you have people that know how to not violate OSHA, such as ICTSI has done.
So
does that answer your question? Or
it sure does. With that in mind, is that part of the conflict that is preventing you from coming to resolution and renewing your contract that expired on December 31st of last year?
Yes, it's been less about wages and more about safety and ability to actually fulfill our customers' needs. As we see it now, it's basically hemorrhaging revenue that we could have and not be dealing with these 7 to 10 day stops and arresting ships on the port. So
let's jump over to our logistics expert, Peter Nelson. Peter, how does that the lack of ability to come to a resolution and renew the contract affect local businesses?
Yeah, I think obviously there's issues both ways, right? So first, if businesses are waiting for their goods to come through this port, you're seeing massive delays, which is obviously not great for the business. And also if businesses are trying to send items out through this port, again, massive delays. And so the options for the businesses are to take the chance that somebody's actually going to be working and offload your container or load it onto a ship, or you have to plan to send your goods somewhere else. So for us here in Oregon, that would be sending your trucks up to Washington or down to California. Neither is great. Washington's a little easier because moving trucks across state borders, weight limits are the same, so there's a little bit less work that way. But if you're going down to California, you have to wait. You have to make sure that your trucks are at the right weight. So taking your chance on maybe your stuff gets offloaded when it's coming through Portland, or taking a more sure bet but paying more money and having more transportation costs. Neither are great.
Wow, thank you for that insight. Ryan, let's go back to you regarding seats at the table in the contract negotiation. Ladies and gentlemen, technical difficulties on Ryan's end. We'll just go ahead and pick it up with why can't anyone from the port union or the Portland unions be present during the contract negotiations? This question is directed at Charles Boswell from ICTSI. further technical difficulties. Jason Zoich from the Longshoremen's Union, why don't you take that question?
We've been excluded from the table talks according to ICTSI. And again, they wouldn't have a lot of issues with safety or OSHA violations, which they've experienced in 2014, if they had our guys on the job.
And it's ICTSI's point that we should not be forced to accept the labor unions in the bargaining table, because it is ICTSI's stance that workers are a voluntary part of this contract. They are not forced to work at our facilities. They can work there at our wages, or they can find employment somewhere else.
What do you have to say about that, Jason?
I think that the only safe answer is through our qualified workers. With the union, you get a promise of quality work for the price that you pay. And
as you had brought up earlier, Ryan, that the courts did did rule in our favor, and our chief executive officer has welcomed the plan that the courts came up with to allow the workers to work at the productivity levels that they were at before the union started to drag their feet. And it's their dragging of the feet and not producing at the same level, which is the reason why one of the reasons why we didn't want them to have a place at the bargaining table in the first place.
So speaking about Elvis Gonda, the CEO of ICTSI, given the problems that the board has been experiencing and with both sides seemingly to blame, why has no one asked for the resignation from the longshoremen or the warehouse union for the CEO, Elvis Gonda, who evidently is expected to be lacking leadership skills to pull such a large operation together? Mr. Zoich, that's directed to you.
One more time.
So with the difficulties that you've been experiencing with the slowdowns, how come nobody's calling for the resignation of the CEO, Mr. Gonda?
We were trying to solve things at the bargaining table level, and we just couldn't follow through and deliver on that.
Got it. Well, his direct quote to the Longshoremen's Union was, "Desperately seeking to distract attention from its own campaign of slowdowns and other coercive conduct, which has caused a substantial decrease in productivity at Terminal 6, and which has caused..." Sorry, go ahead.
I would challenge to say that that's a little upsetting to hear, first of all. But it really boils down to safety business practices, which I think the port is in drastic violation in over making revenue versus doing things the right way with the right attention applied to safety matters such as chassis. We can't move any quicker than the chassis arrive. And that's still an issue that we have going on that's with the new tenant. So, Mr. Boswell, why can't ICTSI provide the correct size chassis? And what are your thoughts regarding these OSHA violations that Mr. Zoich keeps bringing up?
So the reason why, as far as the incorrect chassis, the reason why the incorrect chassis are no longer readily available is because under the prior contracts, the contracts, the way they were worded is when the containers would come in, they would come in with the correct size chassis already on the boat with them. So the chassis were offloaded, then the longshoremen would unload the containers onto the chassis, and the trucks would pick them up and take them on their way. But that was a service that the Port of Portland was providing to speed things up, and it was not a cost-effective measure on their part. We were brought in to no longer have losses. we're here to run a profit. We're a private organization. It's not our responsibility to provide those chassis. It is either the container company or the transportation company, the truck drivers that are showing up to pick up these containers. So if they want to show up with the chassis, they can show up with the correct chassis for their containers.
Why is it then, if nobody is providing the chassis to the union, and you had mentioned yourself that these are for expediting the loading and unloading of the containers, why are the longshoremen being blamed for slowing things down when you refuse to provide the chassis that they previously had to work with? And is there another way?
It was our stance, and the courts did rule in our favor that it was our stance that they should be unloading onto the chassis that we have available, and that would go back and increase productivity. And then in addition to that, that also, in addition to that, we were also given subsidies to start procuring these, because otherwise we would be running at a loss.
Okay, we'll come back to subsidies momentarily. Mr. Nelson, can you weigh in on the OSHA violations and the logistics side of things regarding the chassis?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of OSHA, nobody should be working in dangerous situations, especially in a place like this where the danger is really heightened. So whatever has been found out in terms of the courts looking into it, or whoever's investigating this, obviously, just in terms of general business practices, safety always needs to be a top priority. I don't know if everything has been investigated and what that finding is, but just in terms of general business, safety always needs to be first. In terms of the chassis, again, it sounds like this issue is much like almost any other issue that ICTSI and the union has had, where you get a bunch of finger pointing and you don't get a lot of action. And just looking at it in terms of general business in the state and use of this port, it's massively frustrating for us to all be sitting back and watching these arguments and finger pointing with no resolution and no real work happening, whether it's in terms of good ideas coming to the table, finding mutually beneficial resolutions. It seems like, looking at the business in the state, there's less people that are relying on this Port of Portland. Even if the port gets it up and running, it's hard to see some people coming back to the port just because they're not going to trust that either of these organizations have their best interest in mind.
Wow, thanks, Mr. Nelson. My next question would go to Mr. Boswell. So why was ICTSI providing rebates to keep Hanjin's business, and why would the longshoremen union disapprove of continuing to have work? And Mr. Zosh can weigh in on that as well.
So the commissioners voted 6-1 with one absence to authorize as much as $3.7 million in rent rebates to us, ICTSI Oregon, and to continue operating this container terminal. And the port intended these payments, which come in the form of rent reductions and savings, to us to be able to pass on the shipping lines to the ocean carriers, and they're doing this in the hopes to keep that cargo vessels will continue to come to Portland. And the reason why they authorized these incentive payments is because when the longshore unions were, as Peter had just discussed, they were saying that the reason why we were supposed to hire them is to keep there from being OSHA violations and having employees that could do the work without these OSHA violations. But even without that, they were running below productivity levels, and they were still having OSHA violations. So they weren't conducting the work safely, and they weren't conducting the work quick enough to keep our customers happy. That is ICTTSI's standpoint.
I still, the union standpoint is it still feels like we're being cheated out of our rightful spot at the bargaining table, and then cheated out of our rightful spot at being safe workers and getting compensated for the work that we've done. And I feel like we end up running circles in this, just as Mr. Nelson had outlined, and no one is looking to solve things on the ground between ourselves and ICTSI.
And kind of to go back to the original question, I apologize for missing this part in the first part, is that one of the reasons why we were providing $20 per container incentive payments to Hanjin was to try and continue them to come to Portland, because they are the largest shipper that comes from Asia, because they send so much work our way. We were trying to give them an incentive to, even with these hiccups.
Well, Mr. Boswell, I think the main thing here is you don't have 7 to 10 days period of ships being arrested on the port for non-compliance. And it's this inability to come to a meaningful conclusion for both parties with this kind of activities still going on that are detrimental to all customers, which is why we're losing the port.
Well, these certainly sound like complicated issues, gentlemen. Mr. Zoich, Mr. Boswell, Mr. Nelson, we really appreciate your time today. That's all we have for today, but I'm sure we'll be picking this issue up again in the future. So we really thank you for coming on our show today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.